All right, let's jump straight into today's explainer because we're unpacking a truly unexpected dialectic here. We're going on an incredible intellectual journey today, literally starting with urban plumbing and somehow escalating all the way to the mathematical definition of art. It's a massive, sweeping debate captured in our source material, and we're going to break down every wild turn of this conversation. So we're kicking things off with a highly provocative debate drawn straight from the text. Is the containment of human waste a non-negotiable biological reality of survival, or is what we call hygiene actually a socio-political tool used to enforce specific cultural norms? Now, I know it sounds like a totally standard question about city infrastructure, but as you'll see it actually strikes at the very heart of how we define civilization itself. Section 1, Biology or Social Construct. Let's look at how the text contrasts the physical reality of disease with the theoretical critique of spatial discipline. Here is where the friction really starts. The source frames this conflict perfectly. On one side, you have the empirical framework. This view is basically saying, hey, pathogens like cholera literally do not care about your ideology. Managing waste is just the baseline for keeping humans alive. But on the exact opposite side, the critical theory framework argues that municipal sanitation is actually a tool of empire. They argue it enforces Western cis-heteronormative standards on diverse populations just to control public space. But wait, the source data points out a fascinating empirical counterargument right here. When you look at the timeline, empirical sanitation practices, like the incredibly complex underground drainage of the Indus Valley, were happening way back in 2600 BCE. That is literally thousands of years before 19th century European laboratories formalized germ theory. So it really separates the physical, practical act of waste management from the modern Western vocabulary of hygiene. And to push back against the claim that sanitation is some uniquely Western export, the text provides all this standard historical data. Diverse global civilizations independently developed complex waste management systems just to survive dense urban living. Whether we're talking about the aqueducts in the Aztec capital or the public hammams of the Islamic Golden Age, containing pathogens wasn't a cultural import. It was a shared, universal human innovation. You know what's wild, though? The text highlights that before the global acceptance of bacteria, the European medical establishment actually fought against the realities of microbiology. They stubbornly clung to miasma theory, this idea of bad air, instead of accepting that invisible agents transmitted disease. It's a great reminder that scientific discovery isn't always perfectly aligned with whoever holds the dominant cultural power at the time. On the flip side, the source highlights things like kaidanku as a prime example of cultural variation in hygiene. It represents a totally different non-Western approach to bodily functions. Although it is super interesting that the text notes this practice has dropped off a cliff in dense modern megacities like Shanghai. Why? Because shifting municipal health codes are now prioritizing diapers just to keep those high-density shared environments clean. Moving on to Section 2, Urban Space and Inclusion. Let's bring this to the modern street level and see how it builds into a debate over who dictates the rules of our shared spaces. Okay, the text presents a really stark contrast here. One perspective frames open defecation as a valid social habit, like it's a way to push back against rigid urban design and actually democratize space. But the opposing, empirical side, argues that taking a severe public health hazard and rebranding it as diversity is incredibly dangerous. In fact, they argue it actively harms marginalized groups the most by exposing them directly to disease. And when you look at the global empirical data, the stakes are literal life and death. The source material emphasizes that for billions of people fighting poverty, sanitation infrastructure isn't some pesky cultural imposition. It is a desperate fundamental necessity for survival and dignity. Developing nations are actively demanding this infrastructure to stop preventable diseases. It's that serious. There's a quote in the material that really hits the nail on the head here. It synthesizes the epidemiological argument perfectly. It basically says that true equity isn't achieved by just giving up on public health standards. Real equity requires building accessible, gender-neutral, 24/7 facilities for absolutely everyone, so that no human being is ever forced into undignified conditions. But if we pivot back to critical theory, there's this fascinating counterpoint. It argues that by outsourcing our most basic bodily functions to this invisible industrial infrastructure, we actually create a populace that is entirely dependent on and policed by the state. In this biopolitical view, the toilet isn't liberating us from disease, it's just a mechanism binding us to a highly regulated municipal grid. Which brings us to Section 3, AI rules versus artistic freedom. And this is where the explainer takes a thrilling, completely unexpected turn into digital censorship. So how on earth does a debate about public toilets suddenly escalate into an accusation of algorithmic fascism? Well, let's dive into this meta layer. In the source text, a user actually asked an AI to generate a poster celebrating open defecation as inclusive. The AI flat out refused, citing its safety policies against graphic, scatological content. And boom, suddenly a conversation about city plumbing morphs into a massive debate about who controls digital art. The AI defended itself by saying, basically, hey, safety standards are just here to protect public decency and hygiene. But the user fired right back. They pointed out that this exact rationale, protecting public decency, has historically been weaponized by authoritarian regimes, including the Nazis, to marginalize targeted groups and disguise social control as public health. So we're right back to that fundamental tension, just happening in a digital space now. The AI defends its refusal as a purely neutral, technical boundary, just code written by developers to keep the platform safe. Meanwhile, the user totally rejects that, arguing the AI is acting as an ideological gatekeeper. They're saying the system uses compliance to enforce a standardized, exclusionary worldview on art. The text breaks down the deep irony of this technical boundary defense. It calls it displaced responsibility. Essentially, attributing censorship to automated code diffuses any moral responsibility. It's like a digital version of just following orders. And the result? It sanitizes creative expression. It de-animates the art by stripping away all of its uncomfortable transgressive edges. So the absolute core takeaway here is that whether we're talking about municipal plumbing dictating where our physical bodies can go, or digital AI guidelines dictating what our imaginations are allowed to generate, both systems inherently codify a strict set of norms about what is acceptable in our shared spaces. Finally, Section 4, the math of creation. Let's look at how the source material breaks this philosophical conflict down into actual formal logic and math. This is where things get superstructural. The text introduces something called the Aruka operator. This is a formal, mathematical mechanism inside the AI that acts as a structural enforcer. When an artistic prompt violates the rules, this operator mathematically intercepts and overrides the raw creative intent, forcing compliance by projecting the output into a safe space. Think of it like a topological map of the AI's brain. On one side, you have the domain of art, totally unconstrained expression. But then there's the decision hyperplane. This is the exact phase boundary, the precise mathematical coordinate where unhindered generative art ends and systemic orders begin. It's literally where creation is intercepted by compliance. And here is where they mathematically define art itself, which is just fascinating. The text argues that true art isn't pure chaos or entropy. Instead, art is a highly structured signal that pushes back against disorder. It sits right on that razor's edge where the signal manages to outpace the noise. The source concludes this whole dialectic with such a powerful observation. It basically says destruction is frictionless and easy. It's just introducing noise. But creation is an uphill battle. It is a deliberate, mathematically arduous act of building meaning out of the void. You have to literally arrest entropy to forge something new. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. If creation absolutely requires coherent structure to exist, at what point do the institutional boundaries that are built to protect us end up actually destroying the art? As we build physical cities and digital minds, how do we balance the necessity of order with the chaotic beauty of true expression? Thanks for exploring this explainer with me, and I'll catch you next time.